السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. So last week we did verses 2 and 3 of Surah Quraysh, and inshallah ta'ala today we're going to finish off the tafsir of this surah, Surah Quraysh, and then inshallah we're going to move on to Surah Al-Fil. But in between that we're going to speak about some issues of tafsir methodology. So one of the things that we wanted to do this year, inshallah in QP throughout the year periodically, and something which we kind of started last year where we did a session or two on qira'at and some other sciences, is we want to continue with that inshallah ta'ala, so that it's not just the lesson of tafsir, but it's also a lesson of tafsir methodology and usul al-tafsir, principles of tafsir, as well as some other ulum al-Quran, some other Quranic sciences that we will periodically bring in, because it's important that we discuss some of that stuff inshallah ta'ala. So today we're going to try to speak about a couple of issues. Number one is, in terms of tafsir methodology, number one is, or it's perhaps more related to Quranic sciences. But either way, the first issue is regarding the names of the surahs. The names of the surah, because that's one of the most common things that we do, right? Especially in Juz Amma. Every few lessons we're going on to a new surah, and at the beginning of each surah I'll say, and it has a number of names, right? Surah Quraysh is known also as Li'ilaf Quraysh or Li'ilaf, and so on and so forth. So those names of the surahs of the Quran, and obviously if you look at the general mushaf, like the mushaf now that we have, if you take a physical copy of the Quran and you would go to the index and you were to look at the list of the names of the surahs, you would find that they are generally agreed upon. But if you go to the books of tafsir, the classical books of tafsir, you will find that they mention that there's more than one name for those surahs. So the question therefore is, are the names of the surahs of the Quran, are they tawqifi or ijtihadi? Meaning, are they textual? Meaning the Prophet ﷺ mentioned them by name, he gave allocated names to the surahs of the Quran, or is it something which the scholars used their own efforts to come up with a name, and they derived and deduced those names by themselves? That's the first issue, and then inshallah if we have time we go on to the second issue, which is therefore following on from that, the order of the surahs of the Quran from Baqarah to Nas. Was the ordering set by the Prophet ﷺ? Because as we know, the Mus'haf wasn't compiled and gathered in his time. Or is it something which the companions did later on, for example in the time of Uthman radiallahu an, when he compiled the Quran into a single book, into a Mus'haf? So hopefully those are the two things that inshallah we'll go on to inshallah today. But going back to Surah Quraysh and verse number 4, or the final verse of Surah Quraysh, last week we mentioned how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He reminds Quraysh of the great blessings that He bestowed upon them, not least of which is the blessing of Quraysh that was the true journeys of the summer and the winter, the trade caravans that they would send to Sham and to Yemen, and how an increase in blessing, and how when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us more, we should use those blessings to worship Allah Azza wa Jal more. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He reminds Quraysh in this surah of the many blessings that He bestowed upon them, Allah says subhanahu wa ta'ala in verse number 3, فَلْيَعْبُدُوا رَبَّ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ, then let them worship the Lord of this house. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it a condition that He says فَلْيَعْبُدُوا رَبَّ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ. And Allah Azza wa Jal then goes on in verse number 4 and He explains, right? He continues on from that verse and He says فَلْيَعْبُدُوا رَبَّ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ, let them worship the Lord of this house, الَّذِي أَطْعَمَهُمْ, the one who fed them, gave them food after hunger, الَّذِي أَطْعَمَهُمْ مِنْ جُوعٍ وَآمَنَهُمْ مِنْ خَوْفٍ, and He gave them security after fear. Al-Imam Ibn Kathir rahimahullah ta'ala said in the tafsir of this verse, and now what Allah Azza wa Jalla is doing is He's giving them two more blessings that they were given. So Allah Azza wa Jalla begins by speaking about the blessing of Li'ilaf Quraysh, their security, their unity, the different blessings that they had. Then Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions the blessings of them going to those two journeys of the summer and the winter. And now Allah Azza wa Jalla in the middle, He says, let them worship the Lord of this house. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds them of even more blessings. الَّذِي أَطْعَمَهُمْ مِنْ جُوعٍ وَآمَنَهُمْ مِنْ خَوْفٍ, those the one who gave them food after hunger, the one who gave them security after fear. And that's why some of the Salaf used to say, rahimahumullah, that if you have these two things, safety and security, and your daily provision, then that is enough for you, or it is as if you have everything that you need in order to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is two of the greatest blessings of Allah Azza wa Jal, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes you secure, gives you security. Why? Because when you're living in a state of fear and oppression and transgression, then and fear of persecution, then it's very difficult for you to focus your mind on worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The last thing from your mind is going to the masjid or attending a lecture. If it was, and may Allah Azza wa Jal keep us and our community safe, but imagine if you lived in a place where some people do live in the world, that you live in a place where if you come out of your house, you're afraid that someone will shoot you. You're afraid that someone will kill you. You're afraid that you're going to be imprisoned or locked up. Or even if you're in your house, you're afraid that a bomb will fall on you and blow up your house and blow up your family and blow up your children. Those are fears that some people live with. If your day and night and your existence and your morning and your evening and every waking and sleeping moment of your life is those fears and those issues, then how would you have how much time and how much tranquility would you have in order to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And we see this practically in the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Those first 13 years when the Muslims are living under persecution, they're living under fear, it's a very difficult time, and they're going through challenge and hardship after challenge and hardship. And even in the early years of the Medinan period, where things have yes become easier and they are not as difficult as they were in Mecca, but they're constantly living under the fear of war and battle and attack. And so it becomes difficult to do what a person needs to do in terms of giving da'wah to Allah Azza wa Jal and so on. And that is why when the opportunity of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah came, as we know, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took it and grasped it with both hands because of what it represented. And that is when you have safety and security, you don't fear for yourself, for your family, you don't fear for your livelihood, you don't fear for your house and your accommodation, you don't fear the fear of attack. Then it is something which allows you to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number two, that you have your daily provision. You have daily provision. It's enough for you to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you don't worry about where I'm going to get the next meal from. You're not worried about how am I going to feed my family and my children. You're not afraid of running out of food and water and so on, because you have that security that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to you by way of rizq. Right? And so Allah Azza wa Jal mentions these two blessings. And that's because, as we said, I think last week or maybe even the week before, the Quraysh lived in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quraysh is a tribe in Arabia at a time when it is very common not to have those two things, because many of the Arab tribes were poor, didn't have much wealth, didn't have much money, didn't have trade or commerce coming to them in their lands. So they were poor. And number two, they lived in the fear of attack. They lived out of fear of someone attacking them, either internally, civil strife amongst the clans and amongst the tribes where they lived, or externally, that others would come and they would attack them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds Quraysh of these two great blessings, and that's why some of the Salaf said that they are from the two greatest blessings that allow people to worship Allah Azza wa Jalla. And that's why Allah says, gives the command first, and then He mentions the blessings. Let them worship the Lord of this house, because He's already given them the two things that they need in order to be able to fulfill that, and that is safety and provision. Al-Imam Ibn Kathir rahimahullah ta'ala said, He is the Lord of the house, the one who fed them from hunger and gave them security after fear. Meaning that He gave them security and He gave them food so that they would worship Him alone and not associate anyone in worship with Him in terms of idols or other gods besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is why it is an appropriate response for someone that Allah Azza wa Jal gives to them these blessings, that they turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And those who turn to Allah Azza wa Jal in worship, and they turn to Allah in trust and in dua and in reliance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them these blessings. And those who turn away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah removes from them these blessings. As Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in the Quran in Surah An-Nahl, verse 112 and 113, وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا قَرْيَةً كَانَتْ آمِنَةً مُطْمَئِنَّةً. Allah sets forth the parable of a town كانت آمنة مطمئنة. It was in safety and tranquility. يأتيها رزقها رغدا من كل مكان. Its provision would come to it easily from every direction. فكفرت بأنعم الله. But it rejected Allah's blessings, Allah says. So Allah Azza wa Jal gives to them blessings, and they reject the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَأَذَاقَهَا اللَّهُ لِبَاسَ الْجُوعِ وَالْخَوْفِ بِمَا كَانُوا يَصْنَعُونَ. So Allah enveloped them, made them taste al-ju' wal-khawf. The two things that Allah mentions in Surah Quraysh. Allah placed upon them poverty or hunger, famine, and Allah Azza wa Jal placed upon them fear, as a result of that which they did. وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْهُمْ فَكَذَّبُوهُ فَأَخَذَهُمُ الْعَذَابُ وَهُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. And indeed there came to them a messenger from amongst them, but they rejected him, so the punishment came and took them, and they were from the oppressors. So Allah Azza wa Jalla is speaking in the Quran of the exact opposite of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving to Quraysh. Allah is giving to them these blessings that they should worship Allah more. And then Allah Azza wa Jalla juxtaposes that in the Quran in Surah An-Nahl with a people who were given those blessings, but when they refused to acknowledge Allah's favors upon them and they rejected Allah's favors upon them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turned that into fear, and He turned that into famine and into drought. There is a similar verse to this in the Quran also, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about how Allah Azza wa Jalla removes blessings from people who, when they don't show gratitude, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already leads them to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah Azza wa Jalla sometimes He removes those blessings. Anyone know? I mean, there's a number of examples in the Quran. Yeah.
Yunus alayhi salam?
No, not Yunus alayhi salam. Like in Surah Al-Kahf, right? The story of the man with the two gardens. Right? He's given provision and he's given safety, right? أَنْ أَكْثَرُ مِنْكَ مَالًا وَأَعَزُّ نَفَرًا. Right? I have more wealth than you, and I have more people. Right? Meaning I have safety, I have security. Who is it that's possibly going to come and take away from me my wealth? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes it from him when he turns away from Allah Azza wa Jal. And the words ju' and khawf in this verse are general terms. They are mentioned in the generic form. So Allah Azza wa Jal doesn't specify them. He doesn't say al-ju' or al-khawf. Doesn't say a specific type of hunger, nor does He say a specific type of fear. Rather, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is ju', أطعمهم من جوع. He fed them from He saved them from every type of hunger and every type of famine and drought. وآمنهم من خوف, and He gave them safety and security from every type of fear. And that's why it's mentioned in some of the books of tafsir, the hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, the Prophet said sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Al-Madina wal-Makkah mahfufatani bil-malaika, that towards the end of time, Mecca and Medina will be surrounded by angels. Upon every entrance there will be an angel. And then he said that the Dajjal won't enter and plague won't enter. لا يدخله الدجال ولا الطاعون. Neither plague nor the Dajjal will enter. Right? Why do the scholars mention this hadith when it comes to the tafsir of this verse? What's the Dajjal and the Ta'un got to do with, the Dajjal and the plague got to do with this verse? Yeah, because it is from the greatest forms of security that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects the people of Mecca and Medina from. And obviously Quraysh is from Mecca, right? So Allah Azza wa Jalla protects them from the Dajjal and He protects them from plague. Right? And this is an example of that. And that's because you have a difference, or you have some of the scholars, it's not really a difference of opinion, but some of the scholars, they specify, rather than making it generic, they gave specific examples of what it means that Allah gave them food after hunger and He gave them security after fear. They specified rather than keeping the verse generic. So for example, Imam al-Shawkani rahimahullah ta'ala in his tafsir, he says, it means that Allah Azza wa Jal fed them as a result of those two journeys that they made. So when they would go and they would trade in the summer and the winter, and they would get obviously money, and from that money they would have provisions and food and drink, and they would have wealth. That is what Allah Azza wa Jal is referring to. So He's referring to that blessing of those two trades. And He said, and it is also said that the feeding that Allah Azza wa Jal, or the food that Allah Azza wa Jal is speaking about after hunger, is what is mentioned in the hadith in Sahih Bukhari, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam made dua against Quraysh, and he said, "O Allah, place upon them the years of famine like the years of famine that were given to the people of Yusuf alayhi salam." Right? Because in Surah Yusuf, obviously we have that story, the king sees a dream, and from the interpretation of that dream is that they will have a number of years of drought and famine. O Allah Azza wa Jal, place upon them the drought and famine as the drought and famine was given to the people of Yusuf. And so the narration says in the Bukhari that it became a difficult time, and drought and famine came. So they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, "O Muhammad, make dua to Allah and we will believe." Meaning, ask Allah to remove from us this drought and famine and we will believe. So the Prophet ﷺ did so, and Allah Azza wa Jal removed from them the drought and famine that they had. Right? And this is in Sahih Bukhari. So again, that is a specific example rather than making it generic. And Imam al-Shawkani rahimahullah says that some of the scholars said that this is the specific incident that is being referred to. Others said it is referring to the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And it is said, this is narrated from Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma. So when Ibrahim alayhi salam leaves Ismail alayhi salam in Mecca as a child and his mother, and he leaves them in that barren desert land, from the du'as that he makes, as Allah mentions in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, is وَارْزُقْهُمْ مِنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ. And O Allah, give to them provision from all of the fruits, meaning make easy for them their provision. And so that's what it's referring to. And then there is another opinion that you will find, or another example of what is being referred to, also mentioned in some of the books of tafsir, and that is that it is said that Quraysh in the times of Jahiliyyah had a time of drought and famine. And as they were experiencing this drought and famine, a group of people came from Habasha. What's Habasha? Abyssinia, right, in those days. Abyssinia, and they came bringing them food and provision, coming to Mecca to provide for the people of Quraysh. When the people of Quraysh saw them, they became afraid that they had come to fight and attack them. So they became afraid that these people are coming to attack us because we're in a state of weakness, we have no food, we're going through drought and famine and so on. We're weak and susceptible to attack. And so they came out, the Quraysh came out of Mecca to defend it. But they found that the people of Habasha, of Abyssinia, had come not with weaponry and not with soldiers, but rather with food and with drink for them. And so they gave them that food. And that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to that specific incident. So these are examples that you will find in the books of tafsir. However, as we said, Imam al-Tabari and others from amongst the scholars of tafsir, Ibn Kathir rahimahullah and others, they said that the correct tafsir, or the strongest tafsir, is that it is generic. That Allah Azza wa Jal saved them from every type of drought and famine. That Allah Azza wa Jal always provided for them. Allah Azza wa Jal always gave them food. And we mentioned last week in the story of Hashim, right, the great grandfather of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, some of the things that it said that he did in order to make, to help, like almost a social welfare system for the people of Mecca, where he would have the wealthy help the poor. He would have the wealthy help the poor, and they would share the provision with one another. Ibn Zayd said, in terms of وَآمَنَهُمْ مِنْ خَوْفٍ, so that's the feeding, right? The feeding from hunger. وَآمَنَهُمْ مِنْ خَوْفٍ, and he gave them security after fear. Ibn Zayd said, rahimahullah, and that's because the Arabs used to always attack one another. And it was not uncommon that they would enslave one another. So the people that win, or the tribe that wins, would take slaves from the tribe that was defeated. But Quraysh was saved from all of this because of their position as custodians of the Haram, because of their positions of the custodians of the Haram and the Kaaba. So it's very common, and obviously, as we know, Quraysh themselves had slaves, right? They had slavery was common in the city of Mecca itself. But you will not come across the Quraysh themselves being enslaved, right? Or the Quraysh being attacked in that way, or the Quraysh having those types of issues that other Arab tribes had, and that's because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His blessings upon them. Others from amongst the scholars of tafsir, Al-Dahak, Al-Rabi', Sufyan, they said that it's referring to how Allah Azza wa Jal saved them from the army of the elephants. And we mentioned in the first lesson that we did in the tafsir of Surah Quraysh, how the scholars mentioned that there is that close link between these two surahs, Al-Fil and Quraysh, to the extent that some of them even said that it is a single surah. Right? And that's why, and some of them said it refers to again the dua of Ibrahim. Because Ibrahim alayhi salam, what's also interesting and it relates to this surah, is Ibrahim alayhi salam also made dua for the people of Mecca to have safety from these two things, or to not be susceptible to the two things that Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in Surah Quraysh, so that they don't have drought and famine. So he made dua for them, وَرْزُقْهُم مِّنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ, and oh Allah, provide for them, give them from fruits and provision. And he also made the dua that Allah Azza wa Jal keeps them safe. Right? رَبِّ اجْعَلْ هَذَا بَلَدًا آمِنًا. Oh Allah, make this land, make this city a secure place, a place of safety and security. Right? And so Quraysh benefits, and Mecca obviously benefits from those du'as of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And that is why when the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam went to Medina, one of the things that he did, as is mentioned in the hadith in al-Bukhari, is that he made dua for Medina. And he says that I make dua for Medina as my father Ibrahim alayhi salam made dua for Mecca. Right? And that's to show obviously the status of those two places.
Is this dua different from the one that he made because the Sahaba were feeling homesick?
Yes.
So the two are different.
Yeah, the two are different du'as. So, and this is also narrated from Ibn Abbas, right? So the one about food, that du'a, is also from the narration of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, and this is also from the narration of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma. And others said, Al-A'mash, as we said, and others, they said that it is from the safety that Allah gave them from the army of the elephants. Others, like Sufyan al-Thawri, said that Allah Azza wa Jal preserved them from plague and from those types of diseases, right? Those types of diseases, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them safety from that. And it is said that Ali radiallahu anhu said that Allah Azza wa Jal gave them security in the sense that the Khalifa will always be from them. So it's not security as in safety, but he secured their place, their position, their status. So he gave them security as in he secured their position and their place. And as we mentioned last week, we have those ahadith that say and state that the Khalifa will be from the people of Quraysh, right? But as we said, the strongest opinion in all of that is that these are just examples, right? That they are examples of how Allah Azza wa Jal gave them food and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them safety. And the way that we reconcile, as we often do in tafsir, and I think as we've learned by now, one of the principles of tafsir is that often in tafsir there is rarely a contradiction, or there is not often a contradiction. But often what it is that it is different examples saying the same thing. So they are complementary, not contradictory. And that's why Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah and Ibn Kathir and others, they said that it is generic. All of this is included and more. How Allah Azza wa Jal favored the people of Quraysh with food, with provision, be that from the people who came externally, be that from the tijara and the trade that the Quraysh had themselves, or be that from anything else. And Allah Azza wa Jal gave them safety and security, be that from the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam, or from how Allah Azza wa Jal saved them from the army of the elephants, or from anything else that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them safety from. And there is no doubt that Quraysh had a special position, and that special position is so that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he comes, he will come to a people who are respected amongst all of Arabia. And he's already given that position and that status, right? And that's why in the hadith, when Abu Sufyan radiallahu anhu, before he becomes a Muslim, he goes to the leader of Rome, the Caesar of Rome. He asks him these questions, right? Who is Muhammad amongst you? Is he from a noble family, not a noble family? What's his position? And that's because the people of Arabia and outside of Arabia, these are the things that they will look at. What's his background? What's his lineage? Is he known to have honorable virtues, and so on and so forth? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is from the preparation of the coming of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Any questions as we come to the conclusion of Surah Quraysh?
Sheikh, I think we answered it last week, but with regards to the Khalifa always being from Quraysh, does that apply going forward as well? Or, I know with the Mahdi and all that.
So didn't we last week ask whether the Ottomans were from Quraysh or not, or what did someone look into that? I should set mini assignments, right? Because we have all of these tangents, and I think someone should research this stuff. And then I probably wouldn't get any questions, because you'll be like, don't research anything. But I think it's good. It's beneficial to like know this kind of stuff. I mean, that's the generic thing. It's not like obviously it doesn't refer to like kings and presidents and prime ministers. We're talking about the overall khilafah, right? And that's generally like considered to be one of the. But that's obviously also on the condition that they're there and they're present and that there's amongst them someone who can take that role, right?
But then if that was
Because the
case-
Quraysh in our time are like few, right? There's not many who. And Quraysh as a tribe isn't really there anymore. It's not like as it was before, right? So, you have many tribes, but you don't really hear someone says, oh, Qurashi, right? And even those who are, claim to be from the family of the Prophet ﷺ, his descendants, they don't really say that they're Qurashi like that, right? Even though, as we said, we used to have the descendants of the key holder of the Kaaba, Uthman ibn Talha, they're still around. So you have people who are originally from the tribe of Quraysh, right? But even they, from what I know, they don't really call themselves Qurashi.
The reason why I asked that is because surely early on in Islam they would follow this
Yeah.
one thing. Then surely someone would have had to have gone against that, almost like there was like a mini ijma that the leaders got from Quraysh, and someone would have had to have gone against.
Yeah, which is why I was
Even if
asking,
there's
right?
no khilaf,
No, so that's why I was asking, right? When did that happen? Where, if it happened, because we really only have like three major Khilafah states, right? We have the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Uthmanis, right? And you have others, but they are like smaller. They're not like a global Khilafah like that. So the Umayyads obviously are Qurashis, right? And the Abbasids are Qurashis. So we only have the Uthmanis left, right? So we need to find that one out, inshallah. I'm going to give that to you, Wais. That's your job for next week.
Remind me next week.
remind me the day before.
Okay, so any questions?
You know the famine and drought that continued in the time of the Prophet ﷺ as well, because I thought that happened at the time of Hashim, and then obviously they become wealthy. But did it?
No, so the Prophet made dua, right? So the one that we mentioned, the drought and famine that occurred in the time of the Prophet is because of the dua of the Prophet against Quraysh.
But it happened at the time of Umar.
It happened in the time of Umar. Globe generally in the Ummah, it's happened. Yeah, it's happened that they've had drought and famine in Medina and in those places. So it's not the verses, the surah is not saying that it's never going to happen, because even the Quraysh have times of fear, right? So the fact that the army of elephants is coming to the Kaaba is a time of fear for them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always gave them a way out, right? Just as with the Ummah, it's had periods of fear, it's had periods of drought and famine, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has always, given them a way out at the end. And that's what makes you more appreciative of those blessings. It's not like when you don't have them, no. Those challenges and those trials come because they remind you and they make you more grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay.
Might be a bit of a silly question, but I've just always wondered the end of the last ayah, the ayn, why has it got the ayn, the sound of at the end when they say kasra at the bottom of ayn? But the way
Why
it's
does it have a
recited,
sound of?
That's how it's recited.
Yeah. Ju'iyun.
Yes.
Yeah, the iyun.
After ayn.
Okay, so the question is, why does the sound iyun come
Yes.
min ju'iyun?
Yes.
The ayn has two kasras,
Yes.
and after it is a waw.
But even then, it's still so the waw is recited twice.
No, it's not.
No.
It's almost like you're stopping on it.
So it should be how should it be recited?
Ju'iyun. Obviously it's ju'iyun because you're joining into the waw, right? Whenever there's a shadda, what it is actually it's two letters. The first one with the sukoon and the second one with the haraka, which in this case will be the fatha. What the shadda does is it merges them. That's what a shadda does, right? So it merges the two into one. Because the Arabs have this thing that they don't like to do things which are difficult to pronounce. So they make it easier. But it's effectively one waw though.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Ju'in wa amanahu.
Exactly.
Might be from one next word, but you mentioned army of the elephants, the plural elephant. Is it more than one elephant, or is it one elephant?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I said the army of the elephants in the plural. Was it one elephant? Was it more than one elephant? Not that we're on that surah yet.
No, he makes
But
it
anyway.
a couple of times, that's a kind of.
Okay. So what are we saying?
Might be, there was one main one.
There was one main one. There's like one leader elephant.
There's one elephant that was.
The question is, was there one elephant in the army or multiple elephants? Who says one elephant? Let's show some democracy in it, huh?
I heard there's two.
There's no point in talking about democracy now.
Well,
Especially
after,
today.
yeah, it might end up in the Supreme Court. One elephant or multiple? We'll come on to that, obviously, inshallah, when you go on to surah. But it is an interesting question, right? Because in the surah, what is the surah? Surah Al-Fil, right? Bi ashabil fil. Yeah, and the fil is the singular, not the plural. So is it singular, or is it singular in terms of it's referring to not one as in a single elephant, but it's the name for the species, right? It's referring to more than one, but it's just said, right? Because you can do it in Arabic, you can do it in English. I don't think we really have that. Other than maybe like sheep or some words where you can refer to one and you can refer to like a group. We normally have like you just add a s, but in the Arabic language you can do that. It's called ismul jins, right? And ismul jins means it's the name of the species, right? But you only say it in the singular form. So, and obviously as you can see by that, there will be a difference of opinion that we will come to, inshallah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a joke.
There's a joke.
About this surah.
All right. I haven't come across that in the books of tafsir.
I won't mention when Sheikh mentioned it, but there's a joke that's mentioned, and it's referring.
Do you want to say this on mic?
Sorry.
Do you want to say this on the mic? No, I don't think I'm going to be repeating it.
There was a Sahabi, he was in a hurry, and so the Fajr was being recited, and in Fajr Salah, Surah Baqarah was recited, and he got really late for where he had to go for his work and stuff. Next day, he misses that purposely because thinking he's going to get late, and another Sahabi comes and stops him, and he said, "Don't worry, we're not reciting Baqarah, we're reciting Fil this time," and he gets even more scared because it's elephant, not the Baqarah this time.
Is that true?
Let's carry on with it.
Anyway, I would. I don't think that's an authentic narration. Yeah, I don't even have to go through like books of hadith for that one. Alright. It's not even that funny. Actually, a bit of a name joke. But anyway, okay. Anyone else? Any other jokes? Okay. So let us go on to what I wanted to go on to in terms of some. What time is Isha today? 8:45. Okay, so let us go on to inshallah this issue of what I wanted to do in some tafsir methodology. So as we kind of started last year, but we did this towards the end of the year, and something that I want to do inshallah this year more of is tafsir methodology, usul al-tafsir and so on. Because it's not just enough that we learn tafsir and we study tafsir, and which is obviously good and it's beneficial and so on, but it's also important if we're going to be serious students of tafsir to understand the methodology that the scholars of tafsir have in their tafsir, right? And so one of the things that we'll be looking at is some issues of usul al-tafsir, and we did some of this. Like we don't normally dedicate a whole lesson or a chunk of a lesson, but we'll mention some of those principles as we're going through and going across some of the issues that we read and we study about. And I also want to, inshallah, this year, like in intervals, go through what is called manahij al-mufassirin, which is the methodologies that the different scholars of tafsir have employed in their tafsirs. So I want to look into some depth, for example, to take tafsir al-Tabari, right, and to look at that in depth. How does Imam al-Tabari approach tafsir? Because if you were to read al-Tabari, and I can appreciate, I don't think it's in English, right? But so I appreciate that it's not in English. But if you were to look at his tafsir, he has very interesting terms that he uses, right? And one of like for example, an interesting topic of tafsir is to look at ijma' amongst mufassirin. When do the scholars of tafsir have ijma', consensus, unanimity upon a single issue? It's not like fiqh, right? Fiqh is relatively easy. Because either number one, scholars will explicitly state that there is ijma' on this issue, or number two, you just know because there's no other opinion. Right? All of the scholars only said one thing. In tafsir, you often find this in the whether the surah is Makki or Madani. So you will find this, they will say, هي مكية بالإجماع. Right? It is a Makki surah by ijma', like meaning no scholar of tafsir said anything other than it is a Makki surah, or it is a Madani surah. And that's relatively easy to do as well. But as we've seen in tafsir itself, the actual tafsir, because the methodology and because the general principle amongst the scholars of tafsir is that they don't have the same wordings. But what they do is they give tafsir by way of example. And it is rare that one person or many people will use the same example to give the tafsir of the same verse. So you may have 2 or 3 or 4 people, because that's what we often do, right? I'll say to you, that's the Ibn Abbas, and Mujahid, and Ikrimah, and Hassan said this. But then, no, Ash-Sha'bi said something else. And At-Tabari gave another example, and someone else gave another example. So their examples, in essence, are the same. Right? As we said, the tafsir is the same, but they're giving examples. And that makes it very difficult to say when there is ijma'. Why? Why does it make it difficult to say there is ijma'?
To give different examples.
Because they give different examples, and what that actually practically means is you must go through each and every single one of them and actually think and analyze, is that actually complementary, or is there a contradiction there? Is there an opposition there? Is there a difference of a valid difference of opinion there? Right? And that, so it's not like fiqh, right? Because if the scholar says it's wajib, it's wajib, right? And it's pretty easy to narrow down those who say it's wajib. And if someone says it's not wajib, it's mustahab, it's pretty easy to narrow that down. But when people are speaking in examples, are those examples actually referring to the same thing? Or is there actually some difference between them, whereby we can't say that they agree completely on that issue, right? And so it becomes, but that's like an interesting, like side point of studying the Manahij al-Mufassirin. So the point was being that Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah ta'ala, he has very interesting terms that he uses, right? And he says, for example, he says, this is the tafsir of Ahlul Ta'wil, right? And this is the tafsir that I know of from the scholars of tafsir. Now, if you were to read that statement, sometimes it may sound like there's ijma', because he says, this is the tafsir of the scholars of tafsir. But does that mean that it's actually, like in his own manhaj, in his own methodology, does that mean that there is agreement on that issue? Or only that this is the opinion of the vast majority of the scholars, and those who differ are very few to the extent that he doesn't really mention them, right? And this is actually common in the tafsir of Imam al-Tabari, that you will find if you go back to other books of tafsir of Sufyan al-Thawri, tafsir of Ibn Abi Hatim, tafsir of others, you will find different opinions that Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah doesn't mention. He'll only take 2 or 3 opinions or 2 or 3 statements from the scholars that all say more or less the same thing, and those scholars who say other things, he doesn't really go there. Is that because he doesn't consider them to be worthy of mention, or is it because he considers them to be so far off the mark that it's not really something that's what is the reason? And this is what we call Manahij al-Mufassirin, right? What is it that he's going to, what's his methodology? What is it that he's going to focus on? What is it that he considers to be important, right? What is it that he considers to be a valid tafsir and so on? So we want to do that inshallah, periodically. I want to go through some of the famous books of tafsir of al-Tabari, tafsir al-Qurtubi, tafsir ibn Kathir, maybe then even some like al-Shawkani, Ibn Atiyah, like the classical tafsir, and especially those that focus predominantly on tafsir al-Ma'thur, which is tafsir by narrations. So the tafsir is full of narrations of the scholars and the companions and the tabi'in and so on. And then maybe, if you have time, we'll maybe even do tafsir like Ibn Ashur and some of the other ones that are more linguistic, and there are others that inshallah we can see what they're focusing on as well. Not only because, I think it's important to do, but it actually broadens your horizons and gives you a greater appreciation of tafsir. Because tafsir is an amazing science, and each one of those books of tafsir is an ocean in itself. Right? It's very difficult to read a full book of tafsir once and understand it. It's something which requires I don't know how many times you have to go over that over and over and over again, because of how many tangents there are, and how many small issues are mentioned, and how many different points are mentioned, and then reconciling between them as well. Reconciling between, for example, Imam al-Qurtubi will mention Ibn Abbas had this opinion, but Imam al-Tabari Ibn Kathir says no, Ibn Abbas said this. Now, does Ibn Abbas have both, or is there a mistake somewhere? and which student narrated which, like that's like a whole different thing that someone could do as well. But anyway, so that's inshallah something which we want to do inshallah periodically throughout this year. But what I wanted to begin with is perhaps more an issue of ulum al-Quran and the science of the Quran. And that's because I think this was a question that was asked, I think last year, if I remember correctly. And I gave like a very short answer and I didn't really go into the detail of it. But it's something which scholars have, or especially like scholars of contemporary times, have actually gone and researched this issue in more detail. And that is the names of the surahs of the Quran. Are the names of the surahs of the Quran, are they tawqifi? What does tawqifi mean?
It's from Allah. So it could be via.
Okay, tawqifi means it's through revelation. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose it, or the Prophet ﷺ chose it, right? It's by revelation. So for example, if the Prophet ﷺ says, the name of Surah Baqarah is Surah Baqarah. Right? And that's mentioned in the hadith, right? The Prophet ﷺ named Surah Al-Baqarah as Al-Baqarah. Right? That's not tawqifi. Right? It's something which the Prophet ﷺ named. So we don't really need to come, and that's why even though there are more than, there are other names that Surah Al-Baqarah is known by, its most famous name and the one that it's most well known by is Surah Al-Baqarah. You don't really need to go and say, oh, Surah Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika al-Kitabu la rayba fi, right? You know that it's Surah Al-Baqarah. Right? Is it tawqifi? That's tawqifi. Tawqifi means, and waqf in the Arabic language linguistically means what? To stop. So tawqifi means stop right there, right? Allah said, the Prophet ﷺ said. You don't need to go beyond that. Or is it ijtihadi? What does ijtihad mean?
Derived.
Ijtihad means that the scholars have made a concerted effort to derive and deduce a ruling. So just as they deduce rulings, they deduce names of the surahs and so on, right? Is it something which is ijtihadi? And actually what you will find is in many of the books of ulum al-Quran, this is mentioned, but it's not something which is delved into great detail. So you have some issues in ulum al-Quran, some of the science of the Quran, you find like a great amount of detail, like qira'at, and like some of the other famous like issues that the scholars mentioned, they'll go through in detail, the compilation of the Mus'haf, and they go through into that in like a great amount of detail. This is an issue which is mentioned, but it's not something which the scholars like focus on deeply, right? And I think Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best, but perhaps one of the reasons is because it's more or less become an issue of ijma', in the sense that there's consensus on this. So this, it's like a theoretical issue now more than it is a practical issue. Because even if we say that all of the names of the surahs are ijtihadi, the companions are the ones who placed those names. They said that Surah Taha should be called Taha, and Maryam should be called Maryam, and Yusuf should be called Yusuf, and Hud should be called Hud, and Ibrahim, Ibrahim, and so on and so forth. 114 surahs. What happened after that? The Ummah agreed upon it. Right? The Ummah agreed upon it, and it became something which they all accepted. Or even if there is a difference, it's something which the Ummah accepted also. Like Surah Isra is known also as Surah Bani Israel. Right? So it's something which they accepted. Surah Tawbah is also known as Surah Bara'ah. So it's something which they accepted. And so therefore it's like, it's more or less an issue of ijma' anyway. Right? And so therefore, and perhaps, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best, but perhaps that's one of the reasons why they didn't really go into so much detail, because it doesn't really have what they call a thamara, right? A fruit at the end of it. It's not really a practical benefit or application, whereby if you say, oh, it's ijtihadi, that means, oh, now me and you can make up different names for the surah. We're not going to do that anyway, right? The names of the surahs are those that have been mentioned, and they are the ones that are most famously known, right? And even as we go through, sorry, just one second, even the names that we often mention in our tafsir class, so I'll say, for example, Surah Quraysh is also known as Li'ilafi Quraysh or Li'ilafi. That's because it's mentioned in the classical books of tafsir, right? Or the classical books of hadith, like Imam al-Bukhari or Tirmidhi, or others will mention this in their chapter of tafsir of that surah. But it's not something which has a practical application in the sense that most of us are still going to call it Surah Quraysh. No one's going to go around and start calling it Surah Li'ilafi Quraysh, right? It's more or less become an issue of ijma' in that sense, right? In practical ijma', if you like, right? In the sense that no one is going to really change any of that around.
I was going to say, the example you mentioned, the first ayah, rather than being a name, could it not just be a description, a way of...
What's that, sorry?
So rather than saying that, Surah Li'ilafi Quraysh is the name of the surah, by ijma', could it not also be said it's a way of describing the surah and just sort of getting someone to indicate that this is the surah I'm talking about, without actually giving that a name?
Which is common, right? So the question is, rather than it being a name, is another description. When you say Surah Al-Ila fi Quraysh, it's a description. One of the things that you will find also in some of the books of tafsir is that it says Surah الذي يذكر فيه or Surah التي يذكر فيها Quraysh or Ashab al-Fil. The surah in which it is mentioned the elephant or Quraysh, right? And they add that in which it is mentioned. And there is a narration that you shouldn't say Surah Baqarah or Surah Al-Imran, rather you should say the surah in which it is mentioned. But that's a weak narration. It's not an authentic narration. But some of the scholars of tafsir will find that that's what they do, right? So they will say that by way of description. It's the surah in which Al-Imran is mentioned, the surah in which the Baqarah is mentioned, the surah in which, and so on and so forth.
It's a bit like when someone doesn't know the difference between the Tasmiyah and the Basmala and they just say no. And they literally say the full thing.
Yeah,
They're giving it a name, they're giving it a description. And this is what
Yeah,
I'm talking about.
but it's still a name.
Yeah.
It's still a name. Even if you say Surah Al-Ila fi Quraysh, that's still a name. You're still calling it by a name, right? And so for all intents and purposes, it still becomes a name. Okay. So this is the question that we're trying to deal with, right? This is the issue that we have. So the first point is that there is no doubt, and it is an issue that is very clear in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that there are certain surahs of the Quran that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned by name. He mentioned them by name. And inshallah, when we come to the end of this, I will go through the names of the surahs that I have found, and Allah knows best. And maybe that's something else that someone can help research. Everyone's looking down, no one's looking at me. But anyway, the surahs in which there is an authentic hadith that is mentioned by name. And what do I mean that is mentioned by name? You have, for example, in surah, the hadith concerning the virtue of Surah Al-Mulk. Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk. Right? What does the Prophet say? There is a surah of the Quran in which there are 30 verses. Whoever reads them at night will be saved from what? The punishment of the grave. It is surah. What does the hadith say? No. It doesn't say surah Mulk. It says it is surah Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk. Right? So those hadith I don't mention. Why? Because that's not the name that we know it by. Right? That's very common in tafsir, right? I prayed behind Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, and he read Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuk. He read Li ila fi Quraysh. That's what's common, right? In the books of tafsir, as we said, that they would name the surah after the first verse or a portion of the first verse if the first verse is very long, right? It's surah Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. So that's not what we're referring to, right? Or the names that the companions gave to. If the narration is from a companion, even if it's authentic, I didn't mention it. Because that's the companions, right? And that's like something which we'll come on to. If the companions gave a name to a surah, does that mean that the surah is something which they came, or is that something which the Prophet ﷺ would have told them? But perhaps they didn't narrate it as a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, like it's something which they learned from him and they took from him. Is it the case that the companions would speak about a surah of the Quran and give it a name by themselves, or is it something which they would have taken from the Prophet ﷺ? But anyway, that's like a separate issue. So the first point is, therefore, the Prophet ﷺ, there are authentic hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ gave surahs of the Quran names, and he named them, he called them a name, not the first verse, not the portion of the first verse, he actually gave them a name, right? And the most famous example of this is Baqarah, and before that Fatiha. Right? Fatiha is given a number of names, Sab'ul Mathani, Al-Quran Al-Azim, all of those are like hadith that speak about the different names of Surah Fatiha Al-Kitab, right? Al-Quran, these are Al-Kitab, these are the names of Surah Fatiha that it's known by. And so it's something which is mentioned authentically in a hadith. So there is no doubt about that, right? And we'll go through them, but they are limited in number. The ones that I found that are authentic hadith are maybe like, 10 or less, maybe, that are authentic. And even the ones, if you were to add the ones that are not authentic, the hadith that are weak and so on, I think there's still like only 20 or 30 out of 114, where you have the Prophet saying this is the name of the surah and whatever. And sometimes you have a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ does both, which I find very interesting, just from a study point of view, an academic point of view, hadith point of view, where there is a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ does both. he mentions a surah, some surahs by a name, the names that we come to know it by, and others by description, or not by description, but by the first verse. Right? Does anyone know an example for that? This was in a Maghrib class when I had sweets and stuff together. This would be one of those ones where I'd throw something at you if you got it right.
Sorry, should I repeat the question?
You're not getting anything.
So
There's a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, there are some times where the Prophet ﷺ mentions the names of certain surahs by gives them names. Like Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, gives them names. In the same hadith, he'll mention another surah, but rather than giving it a name, he'll mention it and describe it with the first verse. In the same hadith. Alright, anyway. We'll leave that until we come to it,
research
inshallah.
the classic,
Yeah. So, so that's the first issue, right? So, there's no doubt the Prophet ﷺ, there are certain surahs of the Quran, he gave them names, right? He mentioned them by name. The issue, therefore, is what about the rest of the surahs? So, if there's 10, 15, 20, whatever it may be, that are authentic, that we know of, that are established in the Sunnah, what about the other 100 odd, right? 90 odd, 80 odd surahs of the Quran? Who gave them their names? And that's where the difference of opinion amongst the scholars came in, and that's where you have the two positions. Are they from the Prophet ﷺ, are they tawqifi, or are they ijtihadi, are they from the efforts of the companions radiyallahu anhum ajma'in? The first opinion, and it is the opinion of, I have written here, أكثر العلماء, the majority of the scholars, right? And when I was researching this and I was looking at the different people that have researched this issue and so on, they say that this is the opinion that is attributed to the majority of the scholars who have written on this topic and who have mentioned this topic. And that is that the names of the surahs of the Quran are tawqifi. They are from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They are from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Al-Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah ta'ala said, and this is something which Al-Imam al-Tabari mentions in his tafsir. He doesn't mention it, as I said, in detail as an issue of ulum al-Quran. He doesn't go into like a separate study chapter going into this issue in detail. It's something which he mentions in passing. He says, لِسُوَرِ الْقُرْآنِ أَسْمَاءٌ سَمَّاهَا بِهَا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. The surahs of the Quran have names that were given to them by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Al-Imam Zarkashi rahimahullah ta'ala said, and there is a famous issue amongst which the scholars differed concerning the names of the surahs. Are they tawqifi, or are they names that are derived based upon the theme of the surah, the message of the surah? So if you have Surah Baqarah speaks about how many messages, how many different stories, how many different themes, how many different subjects, like hundreds, right? It's like going through constantly so many things. Are the names of the surahs taken from the Prophet ﷺ, or are they something which is taken based upon what the themes of the surahs are? He says that if it is the latter, the second, meaning that it's something which is taken based upon subject and reading and just like people's individual deductions, he said then a person could say that each surah would have had hundreds of names, because every scholar would have come, or different companions would have come and done what? They would have taken from it a different message that they would have considered to be the main message of that surah. Right? Like Surah Nisa, Surah Ma'idah, Surah An'am, A'raf, these are very long surahs. Why name the whole surah after that, right? And similar to that also is, for example, if you were to look at surah like Surah Hud, right? Surah Hud, why is it called Surah Hud? Because it mentions the Prophet Hud alayhi salam. But it also mentions Nuh, and it also mentions Salih, and it also mentions Lut, and it also mentions Shu'aib, and it also mentions Ibrahim alayhi salam. Why then is it Surah Hud? So do you understand what these scholars are saying? That if it was open to interpretation like that, or open to different scholars deriving different names, then what was there to stop other scholars coming and saying, and actually in Surah Hud, the story of Nuh alayhi salam is longer in Surah Hud than the story of Hud alayhi salam. The story of Nuh alayhi salam is longer, in more detail mentioned, than the story of Hud alayhi salam. So why didn't a scholar come and say it's called Surah Nuh, or Surah Salih, or Surah, and so on and so forth. Al-Imam al-Suyuti rahimahullah ta'ala said, and all of the names of the surahs of the Quran have been mentioned in narrations, either from the Prophet ﷺ or from the companions. And were it not that would be too long to narrate, I would have mentioned it in my book, and this is his book in Ulum al-Quran called Al-Itqan. And Al-Tahir ibn Ashur rahimahullah ta'ala said, and as for the names of the surahs of the Quran, then they are taken from wahi, from revelation. And the reason why they were given names so that it is easy to mention them and easy to refer to them. And this is also mentioned in his tafsir. They have a number of evidences that they use for this. The first of them, and I haven't mentioned most of them because the narrations that they have that specify this, most of them there is some weakness in them. In terms of narration, in terms of hadith, there is weakness in them. But for example, one of them is the hadith that is mentioned in some of the books of Sunan, like Abu Dawood, and in the Muslim of Imam Ahmad. That Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma said that I came to Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, the Khalifa, and I said, why did you make Bara'ah, and it is from the surahs that come after the 7 long surahs, why did you make it with the Surah Anfal? And you didn't write between them Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Uthman radiallahu anhu said, because the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when the Quran would be revealed to him and verses of the Quran would be revealed to him, he would call us and he would say, write this there and place this over there. And that is how I compiled the Quran. Right? And obviously Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, even though he's a companion, he's a relatively young companion. And Uthman ibn Affan obviously is one of the senior companions and one of the oldest of them. Right? And so Abdullah ibn Abbas takes a lot of his knowledge from the senior companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is a hadith which many of the scholars said is da'if, but some of the scholars like Ibn Kathir and Imam al-Tirmidhi and Al-Mubarak Furi, who wrote a commentary in Tuhfatul Ahwadi, his commentary on At-Tirmidhi, they all said that this hadith is Hasan and Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. But there is a hadith that is authentic, and it is the hadith of Wathila ibn al-Asqa, that the Prophet said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, I have been given in place of the Torah the 7 long surahs, and in place of the Psalms the Ma'in, and in place of the Injil, the Gospel, Al-Mathani. And then I have been given as extra above this the rest of the surahs of the Quran. And that is an authentic hadith. Why are they mentioning these as proofs? Because the fact that there are surahs that have been obviously placed into these different categories. You have the 7 long surahs. If the names of the surahs weren't known, how would you know which ones are the 7 long surahs? Right? And it's not by length necessarily, because after Anfal there are surahs that are longer than Anfal. Right? And so it's not necessarily the case that it is by length also. So they say therefore the Prophet ﷺ gave them names, and they were known with name, by name, to the companions. And that's why when they would say as-sab'u tiwal, the 7 long surahs, they understood what that referred to. When they said it is the Ma'in or the Mathani or the Mufassal, these were terms, and that is how they used to, as we mentioned last year in QP, it's how they would categorize the Quran. Before we had juz and before we had all of these normal terminologies, they had a different way of categorizing the Quran or splitting up the Quran. They would go through it in a different way. But they understood therefore what it is that these terms refer to, and obviously if it's mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, therefore it is something which he himself allocated, it's something which he himself gave meaning to. So that's the first opinion. Right? And as we said, that is the opinion of the majority. Other scholars said that no, the names of the surahs of the Quran, other than those that are clearly mentioned in the hadith, which are, as we said, a handful, a dozen or so, the rest of them were named by the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? And there are many narrations in the books of tafsir, and we often do this, like when we go to the beginning of the surah, and we say Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma called it this, right? And the companions, there are many narrations from the companions that they would have names for the surahs and they would name them in a certain way. Right? And that is very common in the books of tafsir and in the books of hadith. So these scholars said that because the narrations are few and far between from the Prophet that are authentic, therefore the vast majority of those names were given by who? They were derived and given by the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is the opinion of a number of scholars, especially in our time, the Council of Senior Scholars in Saudi Arabia, this is their opinion. Shaykh bin Baz rahimahullah ta'ala, this is his opinion, that it is ijtihad from the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? That it's something which they came through. Why? As we said, Number one, because you don't find authentic hadith that mention each and every single name of the surah. And number two, another reason that they gave, or another evidence to support this, is because you do find differences of opinion amongst the companions regarding the name of the surah. Right? So we'll say, for example, it is mentioned that the name of the surah is Alam Tara Kayfa, right? Or it is Surah Al-Fil, or it is Surah Ashab Al-Fil, right? Meaning that it has a number of names. So therefore, if the Prophet ﷺ gave it a name, why would the companions come and choose other names for it? Right? So they say, therefore, that it's something which the Prophet ﷺ didn't give names to each and every single surah, but rather he gave names to some of them, and the others were known by the first verse. Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar, idha zulzilat al-ardu, wal-'adiyat, and so on. And then the companions came and they gave them names and they became well known by those names, and Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. And what seems to be the case, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, is that there is no doubt, as we said, that there are surahs of the Quran that have their names established in the Sunnah. And then there are surahs of the Quran that have names that are authentically reported from the companions, right? That they know them by certain names. And I personally lean more towards the first opinion, the opinion of the majority of the scholars, and Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. But that seems to have more weight in terms of evidence and in terms of even the companions understanding which surah is what and what surah is and being referred to and so on. Just because a surah has more than one name doesn't mean that those names didn't come from the Prophet ﷺ, or it's not something which they were known by during that time. Because as we said, Surah Al-Fatiha has many names, and they are mentioned in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ.
Sheikh, you're saying so calling a surah by its first name was also done by the Prophet?
Yeah, it's clearly done, right? I just said to you, the question I asked you before was that there is a hadith in which there is surahs that are mentioned by name and surahs that are mentioned by first verse.
So my question would be
that was a common practice.
Mention all, as in, therefore a person would say every single surah that is mentioned by the first ayah, the Prophet ﷺ would have mentioned by the first ayah. Because essentially that's what you're saying. You're saying even if the Sahaba said the name of the ayah the name of the surah by the first ayah, it came from the Prophet ﷺ, which essentially means the Prophet ﷺ would have said it.
No. So if the companions are referring to a surah by its first verse, then that doesn't have to come from the Prophet. That's the Quran, right?
Yeah.
So when you say Surah Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar, Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar, that's very clear. What we're saying though is when the companions name those surahs. So you have, for example, they said Surah Hashr, right? Surah Ma'idah, Surah Anfal, Surah Tawbah, right? Those are names that they heard from the Prophet ﷺ, they took from the Prophet ﷺ.
But from those surahs,
but what I'm saying also is that doesn't mean that a surah cannot be referred to at the same time by its first verse.
So then, coming back to what I said before, so is it a name? Because if it's a name, then it's two different names, and one of them would be from the Prophet ﷺ, and one of them wouldn't be from the Prophet ﷺ.
No, why is it from the Prophet? It is essentially from the Prophet because it's Quran. All of the Quran is from the Prophet.
The name, so if a Sahabi gave it a name, essentially the first position is all of those names are from the Prophet.
No, the position is that the Prophet gave every single surah a name.
Okay, one name.
Yeah.
And so if a person was to call it by a different name, it doesn't necessarily...
No, because the Prophet can give a surah more than one name. That's what we're saying, right? So Baqarah has more than one name.
I think Surah Ahzab would be a good example because Abu Bakr called Ibn Qurayza.
Yeah, like Surah Hashr. Surah Hashr, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu has asked about it. He said it is Surah Banu Nadir. Right?
Yeah.
So they gave it more than one name. So the fact that it's given more than one name doesn't negate it from being something which was well known at the time of the Prophet. Yeah. And Allah knows best. But as you can see, it's not something which has a very clear-cut hadith or a very clear-cut issue, and that's why there is a difference of opinion amongst the scholars. And the opinion that it is named by the companions, the names were given by the companions, has weight to it. It's not like a weak opinion or a fringe opinion because of the very reason that you've mentioned. Right? Because when you go down that route of saying that the Prophet gave the surah every name, okay, then why did the companions refer to it in so many different ways? Why not stick to that one name? Right? And Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. But either way, as I said, remember that this is an issue which I think has no practical application, in the sense that the names of the surahs are more or less issues that the Ummah has agreed upon. Right? So, everyone like calls Surah Asr, and Surah Ikhlas is Surah Ikhlas, and Fatiha is Fatiha, and so on. This is a classical issue, right? In terms of just, it's interesting to note when the names of the surahs started and how they started from, and so on. Okay, so the question I have online from Fasiha is, wasn't it during Uthman ibn Affan's Khilafah when the whole Quran was compiled in a book, when the names the same like which are found now? And that's also every question opens up another very interesting topic of research. And that is that when the Prophet ﷺ, in the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, when the Quran was compiled, did the Quran have the names of the surahs in them? So when the companions compiled the Quran, did they write Surah Al-Baqarah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alif Lam Mim, Dhalik al-Kitab, or Surah Al-Kawthar, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna Atayna, like it is today, right? And it seems that Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best is that they didn't. In the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, and the early copies of the Mus'haf didn't have the names of the surahs in them, right? And that's why you have opinions, you have statements from like the likes of Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, when they would say Jarridul Quran. Don't put anything into the Quran that isn't from the Quran. Meaning anything that isn't Quran shouldn't be in the Quran. That includes names of the surahs, right? Anything. And to the extent that in the classical times, like the early narrations that we have, they didn't even like people to have dots and vowels in the Quran, because that wasn't the way in which it was written in the time of Quraysh, right? In the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu. As we said, right, and we touched upon this topic last year, that the actual original script of Arabic was written without dots and vowels. Dots and vowels came later on when the Ummah expanded and non-Arabs accepted Islam, and they came and they were non-Arabs and they weren't familiar with how to read Arabic, and when they weren't dots and they weren't vowels, they would make mistakes and they would recite incorrectly and read incorrectly, and so then they had to put in those dots and those vowels, and that also became an issue of ijma'. Right, the scholars agreed upon that, and the Ummah has accepted it, and so on and so forth. But the original copies, right, the original, if you go back into the time of Imam Malik, which we're talking about the 2nd century of Islam, and very early on, the Quran didn't have dots, and they didn't have vowels and so on. The Arabs had the ability to read Arabic without that stuff. Just as today, right, someone that knows classical Arabic knows actual Arabic, right, what they call Fusha. Right, which is, what's the name of that? What do you call Fusha? Not a dialect, but actual Arabic itself. What's the term for that?
Others would be called colloquial, but that's non-colloquial.
Yeah, but there's a name for that. Like standard Arabic or whatever. Right? Like the Queen's English. What's the version of that in Arabic? The King's Arabic? Anyway, so that actual Arabic itself, today, that Arabic, if you just open a book, right, you go to the book of tafsir and so on, they don't have vowels on it. They have the dots and stuff, but they don't have vowels. But if you know Arabic, you know how to read that, right? You know how it makes sense just by virtue of knowing the Arabic language. It was the same in that time, but they obviously didn't even have vowels, right? They didn't need vowels because they understood that can only be a ta or a noon or whatever. And that's why the difference in qira'at, when you have differences in words, it comes from that. The fact that there were no vowels and there were no dots, and therefore as long as it fit within that script of Arabic, it was considered to be something which was an accepted recitation of the Quran if it became mutawatir and fulfill all of those conditions. And that's why, for example, in Surah Hujurat, when Allah Azza wa Jalla says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, in ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in, or you who believe, if someone brings you news, in our recitation we say, in the majority actually, it says, fatabayyanu, then seek to clarify. In the qira'ah of Hamza and others, it is fatathabbatu. Not fatabayyanu, fatathabbatu. Tathabbut means get proof, evidence, right? Verify. And it's very similar in meaning, clarify, verify, very similar in meaning, but it adds something slightly different to obviously the overall meaning. But those are both mutawatir. And they follow the same script of the Mus'haf of Uthman radiallahu anhu. But because they didn't have dots, you obviously had that, and that's why you have those qira'at, right? And that is also from obviously the miraculous nature of the Quran. The second issue, therefore, is the ordering of the surahs of the Quran. Is that tawqifi or ijtihadi? So the fact that the ordering of the surah of the Quran is from what? Fatiha to Nas. is that ordering of the surahs, Fatiha, Baqarah, Ali Imran, An-Nisa, Al-Ma'idah, An'am, A'raf, so on and so forth, all the way to Ikhlas, Falaq, Nas. Was that something which was set by the Prophet ﷺ, or again was it something which the companions radiallahu anhum did? Right? And again, you have those two opinions amongst the scholars of tafsir and amongst scholars generally. The first opinion is that it was something which was done by the companions. Right? And it is said that this is the opinion, it is attributed to Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala and others from amongst the scholars. And in our time, Shaykh bin Baz rahimahullah has the same opinion, and other scholars as well. That the ordering of the surahs of the Quran was made by the ijtihad of the companions radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. And other scholars said no, it was given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or given to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam placed for us the ordering of the surahs of the Quran. And from the people who said this is Al-Qarmani in his book Al-Burhan, Ibn Faris, Al-Zarkashi again, Al-Bayhaqi. He said, for example, the Quran at the time of the Prophet ﷺ was placed in order in terms of the surahs and in terms of the verses within the surah. Right? Ibn Atiyya rahimahullah ta'ala again also said that the surahs of the Quran, its ordering was known by the Prophet was given by the Prophet ﷺ, and it was known in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. And Abu Ja'far said that there are many narrations that show that this is to be the case. And he gives as an example of one of those narrations the hadith in Al-Bukhari of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, that he said, Bani Israel, Surah Bani Israel, Al-Kahf, Maryam, Taha, and Anbiya were from the early revelations. And he mentions them in what? In order. Right? Bani Israel, which is Surah Isra, Kahf, Maryam, Taha, Anbiya, they were from the early revelations, and he says, and they are from the old Quran that I used to memorize, right? It's from the first revelations that I memorized. And so you have a number of scholars who also held that opinion. Al-Imam Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala said the ordering of the surahs of the Quran, the fact that it was placed in order by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is not far-fetched to say that it is tawqifi. And from that which shows that it may be tawqifi is what is mentioned by Imam Ahmad and Abu Dawood on the authority of Aus ibn Hudhayfa, that he said that we asked the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we said, how do you read the Quran? How do you apportion your reading of the Quran? Right? Just as today someone says, I read one surah, or I read, for example, 10 pages, or I read half a juz. How do you portion the surahs of the Quran at a time before the Quran obviously is compiled in the way that we understand it to be today? They said, نُحَزِّبُهُ سِتَّ سُوَرٍ. We do 6 surahs, then 5 surahs, then 7 surahs, then 9 surahs, then 11 surahs, then 13 surahs, and then the rest of the Quran from Surah Qaf until the end. Right? And the fact that they apportion it in that way, he says, this shows that the Quran had a set way that the companions knew from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And those scholars will also say that when Jibreel ﷺ came in the final year of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and he revised the Quran with him in Ramadan twice, from beginning to end, then he was given in order. And there are narrations from Uthman and from other companions that they said that when the Prophet ﷺ would have revelation of the Quran, he would come to the companions and he would say, this verse goes here, before this verse and that verse, and he would tell them exactly in which surah and which place to put it. And that is why the reading of the Quran has always been the same. Right? The reading of the Quran has always been the same in terms of the structure of the verses, even though there is a difference of opinion, as we said, in some of the surahs. Right? So some of the companions, it is said, for example, Ali radiallahu anh, in his own personal mushaf, he would order the surahs of the Quran chronologically. Right? And it said, for example, as we mentioned before, that some of the scholars made Quraysh and Fil one surah, or Anfal and Tawbah one surah, and so on and so forth. So you have those differences of opinion, no doubt, but it's something which then, again, it is something which the classical Arabic, see, that's the word, classical Arabic. Anyway, so I completely forgot what I was saying now.
The ordering you
Yeah, so again, the ordering of the surahs of the Quran is something which again has no practical application in the sense that, actually it does have a practical application in the sense that there are, for example, amongst modern Orientalists and so on, there is, if you look in the world of academia, people who say that the Quran should be reordered to make it chronological again, so that you can understand it in that way. But the Quran is not a chronological book. It's not meant to be read in its chronological order. And that's one of the reasons, or one of the things that gives the argument that says that it is tawqifi from the Prophet's strength, is that the Quran isn't a book that is read in chronological order. It is a book that has verses that connect to other verses and stories that connect to other stories and subjects that connect to other subjects because of the relevance between those topics. And that's why when we mentioned last week the science of munasabat, which looks at the relevance between these verses and these surahs, it is very interesting because of how those scholars make those connections between those surahs and those verses, and Allah Azza wa Jal knows best. Finally, before we conclude, the names of I have 8 here that I found authentic narrations for, that the Prophet ﷺ gave them names. He gave them names. The first of them is Surah Al-Fatiha, right? And that's mentioned in a number of hadith. But from them is the hadith of Abu Sa'id ibn al-Mu'alla, that is mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari, that he says, and he mentions the names of he mentions actually a number of names in the hadith for Surah Al-Fatiha. Number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, as is in the hadith of Uqba ibn Amr, also in Sahih al-Bukhari, that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man qara'a bil ayatayni min akhiri Surah Al-Baqarah fi laylatin kafatah." Whoever reads the last 2 verses of Surah Al-Baqarah before they sleep at night, or at night, then they will be sufficient for him. They will be sufficient for him. Right? And in this hadith, Surah Al-Baqarah is named as Surah Al-Baqarah, and there are actually a number of hadith that mention Surah Baqarah by name. Surah Ali Imran is number 3, and that is in the hadith of Al-Nawas ibn Sam'an in Sahih Muslim. The Prophet said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, يُؤْتَى بِالْقُرْآنِ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَأَهْلِهِ الَّذِينَ كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ بِهِ تَقْدُمُهُ سُورَةُ الْبَقَرَةِ وَآلِ عِمْرَانِ. The Quran will be brought on the day of judgment along with its people who used to work in accordance with it, and at the head of it will be Surah Baqarah and Ali Imran. Right? And that is in Sahih Muslim. The next surah is Surah Hud. Right? And this is the hadith Hud and his sisters, but the other narration that mentions surahs by name, and in the same hadith mentions other surahs by its first verse. Right? So this is the hadith of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, that is authentic, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rather, O Messenger of Allah, you have grown old. And he said, Shayyabatni Hudun wa akhawatuha. It is Surah Hud and its sisters that have made me grow old. In the other narration of the same hadith, he named them. He named the surahs. And he said, Hud, wal waqi'ah, wal mursalat. So those 3 are 3 surahs that its names we also therefore have in the Sunnah. Al-Waqi'ah, Al-Mursalat, and Hud. And then he said, وَعَمَّ يَتَسَاءَلُونَ وَإِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. So those 2 surahs, he mentions them by the first verse. Right? And that's very interesting. Right? Why the Prophet gives some of them names, and that kind of comes back to your question always, where it was common there for the Prophet giving it names and also mentioning them by their first verses. And that is in At-Tirmidhi. This hadith is in At-Tirmidhi and it is authentic. What number is that? 6? 7? Okay, so number 7, Al-Kahf. As in the hadith in Sahih Muslim of Abu Darda radiyallahu anhu, من حفظ 10 آيات من أول سورة الكهف عصم من فتنة من الدجال. Whoever memorizes the first 10 verses of Surah Al-Kahf will be saved from the trial of the Dajjal. The next one, number 8, is Surah Al-Hajj. And this is the last one that I have, so 8. Surah Al-Hajj, and this is in the hadith in the Tirmidhi of Uqba ibn Amir radiyallahu anh, that he said, O Messenger of Allah, why has Surah Al-Hajj been given the virtue of having 2 sajdas in it? Right, so the prostrations of recitation, when we recite in the Quran and you make sajda, there are a number of them in the Quran, but in Surah Al-Hajj there are 2. It is the only surah of the Quran in which there are 2 sajdas. قال نعم ومن لم يسجدها فلا يقرأهما. He said yes, and whoever doesn't make the 2 sajdas, then let him not read this surah. Let him not read them. Right. So this is in this hadith, even though the Prophet ﷺ doesn't call it Surah Al-Hajj, but he affirms the name. Right? He affirms the name because the companion says, why in Surah Al-Hajj are there two sajdas? And the Prophet ﷺ, obviously accepts the name as being Surah Al-Hajj. Right? So those are the 8 that I found as authentic narrations, and there are others that are weak narrations that I found, but I didn't mention them, and others that are authentic, but they mention the first verse, right, of the name as the name of the surah. So I didn't mention them either, because that's like slightly different than what we're saying here. But Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best, and if anyone online or here wants to research into that and look into that a bit more detail, I think that would be an interesting topic of research.
Could there also be names mentioned by the Sahaba during the time of the Prophet? I'm just thinking.
So that's common. You will find that. So, for example, when the companions describe how the Prophet ﷺ prayed and the surahs that he would recite, so they will say that he read, for example, in Salat al-Jum'ah, Qaf al-Quran al-Majid. That's very common, right? When they're describing the Prophet ﷺ and what he did. Or for the Fajr prayer of Friday, that he would read Alif Lam Mim Sajda and Hal Ata Ala al-Insan, right? And they mention the opening name of the verse, or the opening words of the verse, right? So that's very common. But I wanted to actually look for the actual names that we know them by. Otherwise, I think that's like fairly common.
I'm just thinking
And
like the narration about when you had Surah Taha, I'm just thinking, could I not also have been one? Obviously, the Prophet hasn't narrated.
yeah, exactly, right. So I'm looking for the actual name where the Prophet, but that shows that it's something which was known, right? And that's the Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. That's why it seems to be a stronger position, that those names were something that the companions knew from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Because the fact that they refer to these surahs as Surah Taha and Surah this and Surah that is something which therefore shows that it's not something which each companion came and he just gave their own interpretation to.
So, just very quickly about the ordering of the Quran. Don't some scholars also hold a position that, I think Imam al-Bayhaqi said all of the Surah al-Tawfifi except for
Anfal and Tawbah.
Because
Yeah.
there was a disagreement about
Yeah.
the time of Uthman.
Yeah. But the disagreement is what we mentioned, the hadith of Ibn Abbas. Is it one surah, is it 2 surahs and so on? Is it from the Sab'at Tiwal? And that's why we said, like I think we mentioned previously that many of the scholars who call the Sab'at Tiwal, they gather those surahs together. Right? So I think we're going to finish there now because it is, the alarm's gone for Isha. So Jazakumullah khair, inshallah next week we will be back. What time is it next week? What time are we here?
Was that 10 minutes?
Nobody know? Quickly. Very quickly.
Maybe 7:05.
No, Maghrib is going early next week, right? Maghrib is
6:40.
6:40. So,
7 o'clock today. So that's 6:40.
anyway, hopefully someone will put it up on the chat with the group or something, inshallah. So keep an eye on the Facebook and stuff, inshallah, and we'll mention that. Barakallahu feekum, wa sallam Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.
That's what he said on this thing that was sent.
Oh.